Hello everyone, and welcome to our webinar about the upcoming baseline requirement changes for SMIME. At the end of 2022, the CAP Forum passed a ballot to introduce new baseline requirements for SMIME by September 2023. And today we have Nick France, Chief Technology Officer for SSL, and Tim Callan, Chief Experience Officer at Sectigo, here with us. And they're going into the changes in more detail and steps you should take to prepare your business. As always, we're recording this presentation and we'll share it with you after the webinar. If you have any questions during the presentation, please pop them into the chat function and we'll answer as many as we can at the end. Nick and Tim, over to you.
Thank you so much, Leah. How are you doing today, Nick?
I'm good, thanks, Tim. And you?
I'm doing well. So let's go ahead and get into this. As we know, and we do have, we are going to discuss the new SMIME baseline requirements. There is another also development in the industry that we're going to say a few words about at the end, just because it's important, and talk about an upcoming webinar on that, but we'll get to that when we get to the end. So new SMIME baseline requirements. So the CA Browser Forum has, of course, a set of regulations, what we call baseline requirements, that apply to both SSL, aka TLS certificates, and code signing, and there are different requirements for each of those certificate types. And SMIME historically has been unregulated. It's just been what CAs decide to do. And there are a number of reasons why, that's less than perfect. And so one of the things that's come about is that there are a new set of baseline requirements that the CA Browser Forum worked on. Geez, Nick, I want to say for a good year and a half.
It's been a long time, yeah. It's been a long development. As you said, we've got baseline requirements for pretty much all the other product types in the industry, and SMIME was one that was left to, maybe a few lines in Mozilla's policy, maybe a few lines in Microsoft's policy, because those are the people that care and have email clients. But as you say, it's all been formalized over a fairly long period of time into the new baseline requirements for SMIME.
There's a whole set of baseline requirements. These were passed by ballot late last year, and they gave everybody nearly a year to adjust and get ready. And so the effective date for that is September 1, 2023. So as of September 1, 2023, there are actually going to be some rules and requirements around SMIME certificates. And we as public CAs for public root SMIME certs, we as a public CA will have to follow it. And that means that consumers of public certs need to know what they are and need to know the implications. And that's what we're here to tell you about today.
Yep.
So, SMIME is used in a lot of ways. If you only knew a little bit about it, you might say, oh, well, that's the thing that you put on your email to identify yourself as the sender and possibly encrypt your email. And you're right, it is. But SMIME's used in a lot of other ways too, right, Nick?
Yeah, they've been, used, and in some cases, I'd say misused perhaps over the years for different purposes. Because it's one of the few certificate types, as you said, hasn't been, fully well defined. And so it was perhaps often used for other purposes, such as authentication, because obviously you verify someone's email address and you can use that to then verify their identity to certain systems. But it's also, they've been used over the years to include additional information in these certificates, ID numbers and other things beyond what would identify, a person or an organization. And really, to be clear, what these baseline requirements are actually doing is they're just formalizing the methods and the information and how it's validated before it's signed into a certificate, very much like the baseline requirements for the other products that you've mentioned, Tim. But it's really just formalizing this kind of nebulous list of requirements that all the various CAs had out there, but primarily it focuses on the information that gets signed within a certificate. So someone's name, someone's email address, title, business name, business address, and so on. And as you've said, it distills down into kind of pretty much about 12 different certificate use cases we can see.
Yeah, and so imagine this is sort of a 3x4 matrix, right? So you get 12 total because you get all the combinations of all these things. So there's 4 validation levels. There's 3 of what we call profiles. And what we'll do is we'll walk through them, and then a according to the rules, you can have any mix of validation and profiles. So you could have a strict mailbox or a multi-purpose sponsored or a legacy individual or whatever of those you want, right?
Yep.
And so let's just walk through what the validation levels are, and then we'll walk through what the profiles are, and then we can all connect, how those would connect together. And what the validation levels really come down to, the reasons there's 4 is you can think of it as there are 2 different levels, things that might be changed, right? One of which is there an individual's name associated with the email or with the certificate? And the other one is there a company name associated with the certificate? So you can imagine yourself a nice little 2x2 box just in that, right? Because that gives us the 4 levels we have here. So there's always the email address. That is always in there. That's the minimum we need. A certificate is yoked to an email address. That email address is verified. Ownership of that email address is proven.
It's a bit like server certificates in every single server certificate, whether it's DV, OV, or EV, we always verify the domain names, and they're always done using standard methods, which for email is generally sending an email to the address with a random string in it and a link you have to click on, much like you'd verify your email address when you sign up for any online account. But that's standard across all the validation levels. Yeah,
we all done this a million times. We know how this works, right? So that verification of an email address is required for every S-MIME certificate, every public S-MIME certificate, period. Then we have these 4 validation levels. So one is, we don't care about the organization name. We don't care about the individual name. I just want it for my email. That's called a mailbox certificate. And all you do is verify your email. That's like the S-MIME equivalent of a DV cert, right?
Yep. Simple, quick, potentially automatable, no additional validation beyond just that email address, exactly like a DV cert.
Yep. Next is organization. So there will be a company name or an organization associated with this, but not an individual name. So how would I do this? I would do support@yourcompany.com, sales@yourcompany.com, press@yourcompany.com.
Yep.
And under those circumstances, it's not an individual, but there is an organization, right?
And we would include and verify the organization details in there as well. So as you said, it's like a generic. The sales at or support at are great examples of those kind of certificates.
Then there's what we call sponsored. Sponsored is everything. It's Tim Callan at Sectigo, Nick France at Sectigo, right? I'm using this for my work, and I am using this as an individual. So
and those are the kind of certs that those are the kind of certs that you and I have today as part of our organization, and many of our enterprise customers do. And as you say, it includes the person's email address, their name, and then their place of employment, their organization name and address as well. And all of that information is verified.
Yep. And then lastly, probably obviously, I want to use this as a private individual. It's not associated with my company. So I go get an email for Tim Callan, or a S-MIME cert for Tim Callan. It doesn't say Sectigo, and I put it on my personal email, right?
Yep. And so those are the 4 types that we have, the 4 validation
levels. And then there are 3 profiles, and this really has to do with the use case. So this has to do with how strict are we in terms of how it's being used. And so I should almost probably have put these in the other order. The strictest one down at the bottom is strict, is only for classic S-MIME. I'm putting it on emails, right?
Yep.
It's strict usage only. It's kind of the original intention of S-MIME. Then there's what they call multi-purpose. And multi-purpose allows you to do other things, like for instance, doc signing, right? So if I wanted to use this S-MIME certificate for signing documents, and I also, so this is what I do today. I have a cert on my work laptop that I use for signing documents internally, and I also use it for email, right? So that would be a multi-purpose one in the new schema. So it allows for multiple purposes, and you can use it for the various things that it may be used for, because the scope of S-MIME, as Nick mentioned, has just kind of spread out over the years, and that's a reality that we all have to deal with. And then the last one is what we call legacy. And legacy is much looser than the other profiles, And this is really, I would say this is a transitional thing. This is a way to allow people to get compliant with the BRs with, at the same time, a path to eventually having a much stricter use of SMIME, where the only thing we will have will be strict and multi-purpose. And so the legacy profile will be available on September 1 and will be available for a period of time that is not yet determined, but there is a clear understanding among the people who work on this that the intention is that those will be deprecated. And
Yeah, there was some feedback, I think, from some of the CAs and for some of their users, indeed, that there were places where certificates were in use that would come under these baseline requirements for SMIME, but that were in places where those certificates were used long term. Things like being put on smart cards or hardware, or places in kind of perhaps automated signing systems. And as you said, Tim, the legacy profile was really given as kind of a concession for that, to give them the time to move to one of the other two profiles. It's transition time. We don't know yet when this is going to be deprecated, but we do know the intention is for the legacy profile to be deprecated in the future. And so it really should only be used in those use cases where there really isn't an alternative and that time is needed to transition to one of the other profiles.
And if you have one of those use cases and it's important that those be public certificates, then you need to be working on a solution to not be able to use that legacy profile in the long term, right? That has to be able to be a multi-purpose SMIME cert or another kind of cert or a private route, right? You got to get to one of those things. You can't just say, I'm going to keep using this smart card system for the next 10 years, because that's just not going to work. And those do also have 3 years in term, because part of the feedback that came back as well in this process was that forcing things like physical objects like smart cards to be reissued every 2 years was going to be prohibitively difficult for the people who operate those systems. And so as part of that transition period, that transition plan, those were also given up to 3 years in term.
Yep.
And then again, imagine all the possible permutations of these, right? So what are the key dates? So as we said, as of September 1, 2023, that will be the CA browser form deadline, which means that on September 1, you will no longer be able to issue a public route SMIME cert that is not compliant with the BRs, right? As of the last day in August, you may. And as we always do with major changes like this, we will give it a little bit of padding so that nobody is getting a certificate down to the last day or the last second. So we will have a day that we haven't determined yet that will be a little bit in advance of that, which would be the last day that we're prepared to deliver a cert that is not SMIME BR compliant. And as we look at our schedules and we decide what those dates will be, we will firm them up. Typically for something like this, it would be a month or 3 weeks prior to the deadline.
Yeah, we like to give that bit of padding as much as we can, so that it avoids any problems with any of our customers who, if we did this right on the deadline and we stopped doing these the day before September the 1st, and something caused that cert perhaps not to be issued, or there was a problem in validation, then we wouldn't be able to issue it after September the 1st, and obviously that's not a good experience. So yeah, I would say 3 to 4 weeks out is usually what we try and do on these changes. Yeah. But I think another point just to add on to this, Tim, I think I'd say, or a couple of points, is for Sectigo specifically. Number one is, and I guess this would apply to all CAs, not all CAs will necessarily offer all permutations of the profiles and the identity types that we just discussed, okay?
Right.
So there may be some CAs that may not offer the legacy profile because they may not have any need to, and we may not have, certainly we don't have many or any use cases for those legacy ones. And for us specifically, I would say that the vast majority, if not all of our customers, basically already fit into either a strict mailbox or strict sponsored. We do have a couple in organization and perhaps individual, But for most of our customers, and certainly our enterprise SCM platform users, they will already fit into the sponsored validation type, and we already issue for 2 years or less in general. And so really any transition or any change there is going to be incredibly minimal. So it's just to say, don't go to your CA, whether it's us or someone else, and expect them to have this new array of 12 different product types to choose from. That may not be the case. Those are just the available types in the guidelines, and not necessarily what you will be able to get hold of.
I think those are great points, Nick. And then the other great point you said, just to reemphasize it, is, or to change slightly what you said, is most SMIME users today will not notice any difference. You'll get the new cert from us, the new cert will work exactly the way the old cert worked, it'll be great, and there just won't be an issue, right? And we're not expecting a lot of people to have any kind of disruption or software change or things along those lines. Most people should just get the appropriate cert and keep right on going with their lives.
Yeah, exactly.
And then the legacy profile will be deprecated. As you've pointed out, Sectigo customers, we're not one of the CAs that has a lot of need for the legacy profile. There are others who do. But just for the sake of clarity, that will be deprecated. The exact timing is unknown. I'm going to guess 2025. I think a couple years is the most that the CAB forum will be comfortable with. And I think we will want to give users that amount of time, but we are going to want this to move.
Yeah,
so
I mean,
imagine
I think
that kind of time frame.
I think it's one of these. It's another one of these things in our industry, Tim, where we see proposals and we see changes with no deadline, and we all end up guessing a little bit on it. But it has a similar.
We won't return to that topic.
It has similarities here in that, again, we're talking about the CAB forum baseline requirements, which are adopted into the guidelines that we as CAs are audited against, and that the various trust programs expect us to adhere to. But those trust programs also have their own policies. So if you look, I mean, I know Apple were very involved in this, the creation of these SMIME BRs, and I think it was it last April, Tim? They had tried to push for that 2-year limit across all SMIME, and I think that was eventually adjusted to allow for a legacy profile there, which eventually became the legacy profile. So just understand that there may be changes from the individual root programs to change their policies. And I know, for example, Google, in terms of their Gmail platform and Google Workspaces, it does support SMIME, and it can verify SMIME signatures on emails, but it requires that the certificates are already 2 years or less today, and it has done for some time. So again, just to try and point out that this legacy profile is very much a legacy thing, and it may go away in 2025, it may go away sooner based on the policy of one of the individual root programs.
Yeah, and like you said, a lot of this is just smart cards. It's people literally physically issuing physical smart cards to their employees or other people who need certain kinds of access, and these things are expensive and they're deployed in the field, and they've got literally like physical readers that depend on them, and so all of that changeover is just hard. And so in recognition of that, this legacy profile is there. Probably will affect fewer or any of us on this call today. So the recommended actions, I think, are pretty straightforward. First of all, this is the time to look into SMIME. Understand what you have, understand what's being used in your organization, understand what you depend on. So like I said, people might be signing emails with it, might be encrypting email. You also might be using it for other things like signing documents or providing access for devices. And it's good to know what you're doing with these things. These certs are going to come under some regulation. They may change in certain subtle ways. And it's good not to be surprised. So figure out how you're using SMIME, see what you're using, see where you're using it, and just be comfortable that you're not doing anything really strange and wonky, and that they're going to work in the new world order.
I would add to that, Tim. Sorry, I would add to that that you're absolutely right. People need to check where they're using SMIME, what they're using it for, especially use cases outside of actual email signing and encryption. I'd also say when you're investigating this in your organizations, Also look at what people call client certificates as well. I know we haven't mentioned that so far, but there's often times when, and it happens, as we said right at the start of the call, when we talk about SSL certificates and server certificates, they're often called different names, right? It shouldn't be called SSL today, it should be called TLS, but we call them SSL certificates. And often SMIME can be called client certificates or user certificates. Now, there are those certificates which are not affected by this, right? But there are also this overlap where someone might have a client certificate which they are using for, let's say, authentication, and they may not think that that's a problem and not affected here. But if it has an email address in and it's from a public CA, then it will come under these new requirements. And so technically it is an SMIME certificate. So this is really just to say, don't automatically assume if you don't see SMIME, it's something you can ignore. Just investigate where you're using things like client certificates or email encryption. It's just that SMIME might not be one of those terms that's used everywhere, and it's important to be aware of that.
Right. And if you want to have a look at the baseline requirements, again, it's not really that surprising. These are pretty straightforward, and if you're familiar with the kinds of regulations that are around TLS certificates, it's very much in that spirit, or the kind of regulations that are on code signing, it's very much in that spirit. It's just made for email certificates specifically. And under those circumstances, if you want to read those changes, you can. I put a big long thing in here on GitHub, but you could also just do a search for SMIME baseline requirements. It'll probably be the top result. And you can just go read them for yourself. It's a long document. There's a lot in there. It's a little eyes glaze over if you don't do this kind of thing all the time. But it is there, and that's something that you can read. So, Nick, anything else on that, or do we want to move on?
No, I think they're all good points, as I said, just to make sure you know where you're using SMIME. SMIME is one of these, I won't say it's an edge case, but it's certainly much lesser used than things like server certificates and perhaps even code signing certificates. So most of our listeners will know whether they are using SMIME or not. But as I said, it's still important to make sure people are checking if they're using them for any non-standard email use cases.
Yep, great. So the second point that we want to do is, so there was a news item that came out on March 3rd, 2023, and we have been inundated with questions about it. And so we figure there's probably a good number of participants in this call who are also probably would like to understand more about 90-day certificates. So we're going to take just a few minutes, and we're going to give you the highlight, not the whole thing. You and I did a whole webinar on this last month, Nick, but we're going to give you just the highlights quickly, so that we're all current on what's going on with the news. And then if people want to get into more depth, we actually have another upcoming webinar in a few weeks, and we'll be able to give you more depth on it then. So what we're talking about today is 90-day SSL certificates. So on March 3rd, what happened is the Google Chrome root store, which maintains its own website where it talks about what's going on in the future, which it calls Moving Forward Together, announced its intention to limit the maximum duration of a TLS or aka SSL certificate to 90 days. And you see the language up there in the top. I just copied it and pasted it, or I did a screen grab on my computer. But let's read the specific language. This is slightly exerted, but everything here is up above. In a future policy update or CA browser form ballot proposal, we intend to introduce a reduction of TLS server authentication subscriber certificate maximum validity from 398 days to 90 days. So let me call out a couple things here. One is, of course, we all saw that it's going down to 90 days. From 398 days to 90 days, obviously that's very important. That's the maximum term that a public TLS certificate will be able to be. They also say in a future policy update or CA browser form ballot proposal. This means, in other words, that what this says is, what Chrome is saying here is, we're going to try to do this through the CA browser form with a ballot. But in the event that that doesn't work, we're just going to go ahead and we're going to make it into a root store policy update. So one way or another, we're determined to go to 90. We have the power to take it to 90, and we will take it to 90 with you or without you. You agree with that characterization, Nick?
Yes, yeah. This is Google's way of saying this is happening, and you know, we'll try and do it via the democratic methods first. But if that doesn't go, then we will introduce it as policy, which essentially makes it you know, a requirement for everybody. So it's their way of ensuring this passes and this goes through and is required.
Yep. And this is a policy change, not a programmatic change, and that's an important difference. A programmatic change would be them saying the Chrome browser will not honor any certificate that's more than 90 days in length. And if that were the case, then, you know, if you said, well, look, I'm confident that these certs aren't going to be used on the Chrome browser because they're just for server-to-server internal communications, you could go ahead and order one-year certs. But that's not what they're saying. They're saying this is a policy change, which just means that any CA that issues certs more than 90 days, whether or not that CA is issuing those certs for use with the Chrome browser, will still be in violation of their root store program. And what that does is that has the power to force that all public TLS certificates go down to 90 days in term, regardless of where they're being used. And by the way, this is the same thing that Apple did a couple years ago when they forced one-year certificates. They did that as a programmatic change. And so once again, it didn't matter if you said, well, these are never going to touch the Apple technology stack. It still had the power to force everybody to go down to one-year certs because nobody wanted to be in violation of the Apple root program.
Yep.
Now, the other thing, so here's an expected timeline, right? Just that's the same thing. Or here's our expected timeline. So we think that, and I see I wrote CABF ALIT instead of ballot. I just noticed that right now. So I will fix that in ALIT. So in spring 2023, let's say the summer. Oh no, that's existing. That's going on right now. Let's set that one aside. We think that maybe in the summer, Google will probably introduce a ballot for a 90-day certificate lifespan, and that may pass and that may fail. And whether that passes or fails, we do expect that Google will move forward one way or another, either in the ballot or by issuing a declaration sometime this year. And they'll give us about a year. So our best estimate is that in October of 2024, we will probably all be down to issuing certificates that are not more than 90 days in term.
So this is in the absence of Google publishing a timeline yet, and of course, if they do, you know, you and I will be talking about it everywhere, I'm sure. But this is Tim and Nick's kind of best guess timeline for this, and we're pretty confident about this. I think this is where we think it's going to land. But one of the things I said on our many previous discussions we've had on this, Tim, is as well as this being a guess, this doesn't mean this is something anybody can leave and sit around and, you know, sit on your hands and wait and just think, oh, Google haven't announced it yet, or it's the back end of last year. This is something you need to start looking at today without hesitation, really.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, if you're going to start thinking about what does this mean for me and my processes and my systems, some of the implications of this, some of the changes you may need to make, and that might be roadmap items and that might be process changes. Some of that stuff could take a long time. And if you get going on it now, you can give yourself a nice year to get that done and you're okay. If you don't get going on that now and you wait until Q4, then, or this time next year, then you're suddenly going to be in a crisis. So part of the reason we're out there telling this to people early is we really want everybody to understand that this is coming, to start thinking about what it means, to start working on your systems and processes and understand what you're going to do about it. So let's be clear, this is coming. This isn't an if, it's a when. And this is our best guess of when. Now, if this is an interesting subject and you would like to learn more about it, Nick and I and some others will be participating in a panel webinar that's coming up basically in 2 weeks on May 18th. and it's called the 90-Day Certificate Validity Panel, and we will be fielding direct questions and conversation from the participants, from you, and I'm really looking forward to that. So look for an invitation on that. Also, if you want more detail on this, Nick and I recorded a webinar last month that went into much more detail on this basic story. You can go find that on demand at sectigo.com, and we'd encourage you to come watch that as well. And you want to add anything to that, Nick?
No, I think looking forward to this in 2 weeks' time, and hopefully we can get another. I mean, the last few webinars we've done have been very highly attended. We've had a lot of great questions, and it'll be good to have a a proper panel session where we can have more and more questions and a more open discussion. It's one of the biggest changes our industry has seen, and I think everybody knows that and wants to find out what they can do to help get through it, basically.
I completely agree. So if you like this conversation, I do co-host a podcast with one of Nick's and my comrades in arms, Jason Sirocco. Jason and I are putting up multiple episodes every week. It's called Root Causes. You can find it in all the places you listen to podcasts. We cover a broad range of subjects involving certificates, encryption, digital identity, blockchain, post-quantum crypto, and more. Please feel free to join us. We have a big backlog of episodes and new episodes coming all the time, and we'd love to have you join us. And with that, I think, Leo, we are ready for questions.
Brilliant. Thanks, Nick. Thanks, Tim, for the insights. Question 1. Does the new multi-purpose scheme also consider classic SMIME certificates with multiple email addresses in the SAN?
Yes, basically the multiple email addresses in the SAN as RFC 822 names is a standard thing and applies across all the cert types, because they're, again, it's a bit like the server certificates where you can have multiple domain names in both DV, OV, and EV. So yes, it's considered. Yes, it's absolutely acceptable, and I believe they can be used in any of the different validity and profile types, as long as the email addresses are all correctly validated. You can have multiple email addresses in any of those certificates.
Yes, and they will each need to be validated.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Great. Then someone that's done a bit of homework already has a question about section 3 of the baseline requirements. And in it says that CAs may allow variations or abbreviations of personal names if consistent with local practice. So if someone uses a different spelling of a name than maybe in their passport, will CAs allow that?
Yeah, I think so. All right, go ahead, Nick.
I was going to say, I agree. I believe so. I mean, naming is a very difficult thing to get right. Both globally, it varies from country to country and culture to culture. But there's also a lot of differences in what people are known as and what people are legally known as. I mean, I'm legally Nicholas, but go by Nick. And Tim, you're Tim, but you may be Timothy on your passport, on your birth certificate. And those kind of variations and spellings are absolutely acceptable. I mean, ultimately, we know who we're talking about, and there's plenty of other identifying information. We certainly intend to allow that, and I believe the BRs do allow for that. So it may vary depending on CAs, but I would imagine they are allowed. Under the sponsored profile as well, what happens is the organization is essentially delegated the ability to enter effectively their employee names in there, and so they can make that decision as to Nick versus Nicholas or Tim versus Timothy, and those will be accepted and signed by the CA.
Thank you. Another question was, and I think there was 2 very similar, how exactly is email validation done for the validation level sponsored? Will there be individual challenge emails sent to every requester at application time?
Yeah, I believe this one has also had some discussion in the CAB forum groups, and my understanding is that it can be done so that the domain is verified as being controlled by an organization, and them in their capacity as what we call an enterprise RA, where they are able to issue things for their domains and their organizations, they won't have to do individual email address verification. And that's how we work today. So if your organization is an enterprise Sectigo customer, we verify the control of your domain name, through the standard methods, and then we allow you to issue email SMIME certificates for any address at that domain, because you proved you own the domain and you proved that you could create any email address you wanted anyway. So yeah, we under the sponsored profile, you are allowed to do that without requiring individual email challenges for every single address. Of course, some people may choose to do that. Some people may choose to use that to deliver the certificates to their end users or employees, but they don't have to be done that way. They can be done with a single domain challenge.
Brilliant, thank you. What is the best way to issue SMIME certificates for small to medium-sized businesses?
That's a tricky one, I'd say. I mean, it very much depends on what kind of infrastructure, I guess, that those small to medium businesses are using. SMIME, and we mentioned before, one of the reasons it's not, as popular perhaps as things like server certificates, which are everywhere, and code signing, is because it only works with certain email clients and certain email solutions. So, the SMB would have to use, say, something like Outlook with Office 360 or Microsoft 365, or they'd have to be an Apple shop using Apple Mail. And if they were doing that and they wanted to use SMIME, then there are various solutions that can help to automate the deployment there. So again, if you look at the Microsoft world, they have something called Intune, which is their device management solution where you can manage everybody's laptops and phones and computers, and you can use that to automatically deploy SMIME certificates. So certainly when you're an SMB or an enterprise that has that kind of solution in place, then there are nice automated methods. If you're perhaps a smaller SMB that doesn't have those or doesn't use them, then you're probably looking at individual invite-based enrollment for each user. So they would receive an email, they would click a link, follow a process, and then they would be delivered a certificate separately without it being automatically enrolled. So there's a lot of different ways. I'm afraid there isn't one specifically simple answer. But if you want to get in touch with us, I'm sure our sales team will happily guide you to a suitable solution once you can fill them in on some of your infrastructure requirements.
Great. Next question is it possible for SMIME certificates to have a short validity period of 90 days, similar to SSL certificates?
I think the answer there, yes. I mean, we certainly can do that. There's no lower restriction on how long the certificates can be issued for. There haven't been any requirements like the Google one we've discussed to reduce that lifetime down other than to 2 years. So it's certainly possible. And if someone wishes to experiment with that and try that, then they can absolutely get in touch with us. The only thing I would say there, and it's more of a general statement, is SMIME can be used to both sign emails and encrypt them. And encryption is data at rest. And when you have data at rest, rotating keys on that frequency, you do have to consider, do I need to keep copies of these keys long into the future because I might need to decrypt something I encrypted last week or last month? And so I would encourage anybody looking at or thinking about shorter term SMIME certificates to think about what they're using them for and whether they might need some kind of key escrow or key archival solution as well if they're encrypting data.
Okay. What are the requirements for user identification for SMIME certificates, and what kind of information like ID card number must be stored?
Sorry, can you repeat the end of that question?
Yeah.
I'm afraid the audio dropped out for me.
Oh, sorry. What are the requirements for user identification for SMIME certificates, and what kind of information like ID card number must be stored?
So we, again, the baseline requirements that you can read do have a lot of detail about how we can actually verify that information. Generally, it tends to be like government issue photo ID. And we as a CA would obviously require to receive copies of that, and we would be able to verify it. I think there are potentially options like kind of video ID and things like that we have done, and other providers have been able to do as well. But ultimately, it's about verifying your government name in the individual case, verifying your sort of government legal name using ID. As to how long we store it for, I'm not entirely sure off the top of my head how long we keep that for, but obviously we have some requirements to keep it for our auditors, but obviously things like GDPR come into play there as well.
I'd have to confirm that, but I think it's 7 years.
Yeah, that sounds about right. Yeah.
Okay. Then we have a similar question around identification again. Will the baseline requirements changes influence requirements for necessary validation of individual identity, e.g. for the sponsor validated certificates?
Yeah, I think a lot of these questions are trending towards, how basic, as I said earlier, naming is difficult, but how you verify and how you verify individual identity. I mean, I think the guidelines may change in the future. They're certainly very fluid documents. If you look at the other ones, they change with some regularity, and that's both, to change things for the better or to fix potentially loopholes or potentially errors in these documents. Will it mean that things are changed for the sponsored profile? Possibly. I honestly can't say. I don't think we can necessarily say what it's going to change to in the future, but there may be calls to make the identity verification more strict in the future, specifically for things like the sponsored profile, or it may be the opposite. Things may be taken to consider that, again, naming is a difficult problem, and so it doesn't perhaps need to be as tightly regulated. But I think only time will tell there, right, Tim?
Yeah, I agree with that.
Cool. I think one final question we've got. We heard that organization identifier is also needed in sponsor validated and organization validated for all profiles. So will existing customers be updated with this info via Sectigo?
Yeah, so the organization validation is basically the same process we do today. So again, if you're an enterprise customer with us, we validate your organization. That information is valid for, approximately a 1-year period, and we can include that in any certificate types that require that organization verification. So it will apply to, OV certificates, EV certificates, and organization or sponsored SMIME. So the process will remain the same, and we will be able to reuse those validations we performed for the profiles that include organizational information.
Right.
Right.
That, of course, is if you're a Sectigo certificate management user, right? Because that's where all that stuff is. If you're coming and just buying individual certs from us in retail, then that may have to be redone under those circumstances.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Great. I think we managed to get through all the questions. If you have any more questions, do get in touch with us directly. We've got plenty more webinars coming up. Like Tim mentioned, the 90-day validity panel coming in 2 weeks' time. So keep an eye out on our website or also on your inbox, and we hope to see you again soon. Thank you for your time.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Leo. Thanks very much, Tim. Thanks, everybody.